Hello everyone, welcome back to Unraveling Politics, a weekly political analysis show where I look ahead to the future at political events as well as review the ones that just happened. If you're new, please be sure to like the videos if you like them, and if you're a regular, please subscribe so that you get alerts as to when new episodes are out. So this podcast is going to be a little bit different than usual, but I thought it was important to talk about. I will be discussing what an undergraduate political science major does and how to know if that's the right major for you. So I'll begin with my credentials as I talk about this. I graduated about a year ago from a university in Pennsylvania with 2 degrees, a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and a Bachelor of Science in Public Administration, and I graduated summa cum laude, so I definitely feel qualified to talk about this. And I also wrote a book about my experiences in college, linked down below. I got a softcover version here and hardcover version here, and there's a little bit more in there, the detail that isn't here. This is a great podcast for people who are thinking of majoring in political science, who want to know more about the field and maybe a little bit of how I got to where I am today. So I'm going to dispel some myths, and then I'm going to talk about why I chose it and what I thought was valuable in the degree and where I thought it fell short and how it shaped this podcast over the last 2.5 years and where it landed overall. So a common myth for a political science degree is that people think you want to be president or an elected politician. A lot of people say, oh, you want to be president, not in a snide way, but it's supposed to be funny, and I think that's because most people didn't understand what the degree was. So we're going to talk about that. I would argue that political science has a lot of overlap with history, psychology, sociology. So for me, I was always interested in history, but I didn't really care about what arts or sports or whatever a civilization did. I was more into what the government did and what they had and what kind of their politicians were, etc. And as for psychology, I would say that political science is like, instead of studying the person, you're studying the entire government of the organization, and that goes in hand with sociology. Those, I would argue, are the most similar majors. A common misconception, another one, is that we argue all the time and we like to debate about stuff, and yeah, that's partly true, but as I got older, I cared less and less about that. Middle and high school me, yes, but not so much today. There's a lot of morons out in the world, and I don't really care what they think, and I don't really want to talk to them for an extended period. Lastly, I think one of the biggest misconceptions, and this was one I didn't really anticipate, was that political science is not really about policy. There's a little bit of policy discussion in a political science degree, unless there's very little about it unless you're taking a specific public policy class, which I did for my public administration degree. The degree itself spends a lot of time on political parties, how governments are arranged, theoretical stuff. There's some research in there as well, and I did a big research project. I wrote a 30-page paper on politics in the European Union and presented that at the Pennsylvania Political Science Conference last year in 2025. The degree, as I said, spends little time on economics, on policy, or even just the politics of other countries. If you're a long-time listener of this show, you'll learn that you'll believe that's where my strongest skill set is, how governments work as opposed to individual policy proposals. And as for economics, policies, and the other politics of other countries, I've spent a lot on my own working about that. As I'll explain later, most of what I know about politics is from my own learning, not from my formal education. So that's that. I wish everyone knew that, or at least it would have made my life a little bit easier in the last 5-6 years. So that leads to my personal story. I picked political science in the spring of 2020, right as the pandemic was beginning. My political awakening, as I described in my book here, was back in 2016. However, that 2020 to early 2022 period was a very formative period in my life, and the person I am today is very different than I was before the pandemic. And I think this show would be radically different if I was the person in 2019. We spend a lot of time saying that we define our times, but not a lot of time saying that how our times define us. And I think that was a very defining period of my life when I was 17 years old. So through my undergraduate program, as I described in my book, I added a second major in my sophomore year, that being public administration, which I'll do a separate podcast about if there's interest, and I now am pursuing a master's degree in public administration. And I'll just say that I wanted some more hands-on concepts that were practical as opposed to just politics, and that's where public administration came in. Then I did internships and volunteering in the political field. I worked for 3 elected officials here in Pennsylvania and a nonprofit. All of this is in my book, as I said, if you want to know more. So I feel for somebody who's a year out of college, I bring a lot of experience to the table compared to other people who are in their 20s. Next, Was the degree valuable? And I think most importantly, the degree honed my writing skills. I don't think I could have written 2 books without some of the professors I had. I think the degrees that I got gave me space to hear differing opinions outside of the echo vacuum that I was in on the internet from that 2020 to 2022 period. I also met Dylan at school. He was on the show about 2 years ago during the presidential election. He was not a political science major, but clearly politics and our interest in politics brought us together. Joe, another friend of mine on the show who's been in a few times over the last few years, politics brought us together, even though we met 11 years ago. Those are the strengths of the program, and by the way, it differs based on the school, so I recommend to high school seniors and transfer students to reach out to alum of the school to talk about the program and ask for different schools' feedback. As for the negatives, I think the program I felt fell short in a few key ways. There is a big gap between academic political science and actual experience in politics. For example, I would say 90% of what I learned about politics was from outside school, whether it was from reading, following the news, watching videos, being outdoors, and listening to different political takes, stuff like that. There's also very little I learned completely in class. I had studied politics for 6 years prior to becoming a college freshman, so I've studied politics for about 10 years now, and I could probably have a PhD at this point, and if any university out there wants to give me an honorary doctorate, I'd be more than happy to take it. But ultimately, I think with schooling is that it is always behind on the times, especially academia. I do not like academia at all. Academia is very circular and self-absorbed, and I think has failed to understand a changing world, and thankfully it is not too bad. They're starting to finally tackle AI and grade inflation post-COVID, like Harvard University now. They're limiting the number of A's they give out. The idea is that if everyone gets an A, what does an A really mean? For example, academia failed to prepare me to realize how chaotic a second Trump term would be, and that is one of the biggest failures politically, is that I did not see what a second Trump term would bring. It is far worse than I could have ever imagined, and I wish Harris had become president. She was dumb as a doorknob, and she would have been an awful president, but it would not have been as bad as this. Academia is filled with liberals, and I had surrounded myself with people who believed that Trump would not win, that Kamala had it in the bag, and that Trump was a bad candidate, which the contrarian in me recoiled and made me dig in deeper. Anyway, I don't want to do a post-2024 election analysis right here, but that's some of my thoughts. So I'll kind of just say that academia does not really have diverse viewpoints, and that is a big failure of academia more generally. Anyway, you might wonder, how did my background shape this show over the last 2.5 years? Well, I would say the degree itself didn't really. As I said, 90% of what I learned was outside of school. Writing these scripts definitely got easier with the help of school, but then again, it has been a lot of work with school alongside it, so there's that. Overall, a degree in political science is good for people who are interested in studying politics, and this is where I'll broaden it for you guys. If you're interested in studying political science, once again, this was the kind of stuff in my book as I released last year and said again this year. So, and I released it again this year. I believe that nobody should go to college undeclared. College is an investment, and spending time and money for nothing is a bad idea. There's plenty of fields to go into with a poli-sci major. There's obviously ones that are teaching political science or social studies. There's law. Those are the most well-known. Then there's working for elected officials on Capitol Hill, like in Washington, D.C., for state officials in local and state and government agencies. And this is where a minor or double major in public administration is very helpful. There's also government affairs for companies, lobbyists, and nonprofits. Then there's journalism. The field really is endless, but this episode has to end eventually. So that is it for now. Thank you for tuning in into this episode, as always. If there's a demand, I can make a video about public administration, which is arguably even less known than political science, both the bachelor's program and the master's degree program. And as always, like and subscribe. And if you are interested in my books where I detail this down below, you want to take a look at chapter 3, please check out in the description, and you can purchase on Amazon. Bye-bye.